Kuyper was self-consciously doing a new thing in some sense with working with his work on common grace. So the way he describes it is that rising out of the Reformation, many of the controversies of the day that took up the time and energies of reformers like Calvin and Butzer and Luther and Zwingli and others really were focused on what you might call questions of special grace. So they had to do with questions of soteriology in the church and the sacraments. Many of these things I've already mentioned. And Kuyper says that's entirely appropriate because that's where the greatest errors were. So that's where the attention needed to be focused. Theologians needed to focus their attention on these controversies because those were the things that were focused at that time. Those were the great fights of the day. As you get into the later generations of reformers in the post-Reformation period, Kuyper becomes more critical about the developments theologically. He once you get into the 17th century, on the one hand, he's very appreciative and certainly steeped in Reformed scholasticism and Reformed orthodoxy of the 17th century. At the same time, he thinks they continued to fight some of the same fights, and the disagreements and controversies became increasingly narrow, and even, he might say, focused on minutia and splitting and dividing and arguing over things that maybe are important to get right, but maybe aren't the reasons that you should be living as a theologian day to day, or certainly forming new churches or having all these kinds of social consequences. So there's a kind of a critique for Kuyper about the direction of post-Reformation theology in that sense, that it stayed focused exclusively on what he would call special revelation, special grace. And even though in a theologian like Calvin, very clearly there's an acknowledgement and appreciation for a confession of common grace, it doesn't get developed. And so this is his critique, basically, that there was a need for what, as I've already referred to, a theology of and for the organic church, the broader church, that just wasn't developed from Kuyper's perspective sufficiently in the Reformation and post-Reformation period. So he thinks it's a lacuna in the history of Reformed dogmatics and theological development that he himself is going to address. And so that's why he spends so much time on it, because he thinks this is really where the key fight is, the key work needs to be done in his own day. The soteriological questions, not exclusively. I mean, he was controversial in a number of areas, including questions related to, the institutional church and special revelatory doctrines. But this is where he identified the key fight and why he spent so much energy on it, because he thought this was an underdeveloped aspect of Reformed teaching that really needed focus in the modern world. So you can imagine that's controversial for a number of reasons. It's controversial because it seems like it's not properly deferential or respected of the old Reformed fathers of the day. So Kuyper appreciated figures like Lucius, but he wasn't above criticizing when he thought they were wrong. And so in turn, when we read somebody like Kuyper, we should respect Kuyper and just give him the same attitude.
Right.
And maybe he wasn't properly deferential, or was, or whatever. But I mean, it wasn't simply a repristination of Reformed orthodoxy in the 19th century Netherlands he was attempting to do. He was attempting to take this living faith and apply it responsibly in his own day. So from a kind of a traditional perspective, he's not sufficiently deferential or appreciative of the Reformed inheritance. He's too worldly. This is another concern. And certainly I think a legitimate danger of an overemphasis on common grace. We've already talked about a little bit in the context of this discussion on the antithesis. You can get a kind of a common grace Kuyperianism that really doesn't talk much about the antithesis, or is really, I think, optimistic about the possibilities of cultural engagement and discipleship, overly optimistic about transformation of culture.
Indeed, right.
And I think this is large. So, for example, to bring it up to modern day, this is largely what motivates criticisms of someone like David Van Drunen about the Kuyperian tradition, or at least some version of the Kuyperian tradition. It's overly optimistic and triumphalist with respect to cultural engagement, things like that. So you have church splits. I mean, in the Christian Reformed Church in North America,
the Protestant Reformed Church in
the Christian
23.
Reformed Church, codifies common grace in the early 20th century as a formal teaching of the church, not at a confessional level, but as a kind of a denominational position. And you have disagreements from people like Herman Hoeksema and the Protestant Reform, and so you have church schisms and splits over this kind of a doctrine too. So I guess that's a kind of a, maybe going on too long, but there's a lot more to be said, and it's a living, controversial kind of a doctrine. I think partly because it is so dynamic and inspiring, but also because with any true thing, there are dangers to overemphasis or to misinterpretation or misapplication.
Yeah.
But